Sayeed, are you familiar with Operation Gladio?
Yes. Ron, are you there? Hello, Ron?
Seems like we lost him.
Go ahead, Nashid.
Okay. Well, Operation Gladio was a series of terrorist actions taken in Europe where bombings were done, many people were killed. It was done throughout several European countries, and later it was admitted that it was done by the CIA. But it was done to blame the communists at the time because that was the enemy that they wanted to go after. And it was none other than, I believe, one of the Italian prime ministers, after seeing a terrible act take place where children were killed, that he came forward and exposed that these actions were not being done by the people who were being blamed for it, but actually being done by the CIA to target the communists. So in the same way, you look at 9/11, when we consider the Project for the New American Century, the Project for the New American Century has definite goals. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, prior to the Project for the New American Century, there was a paper called A Clean Break, A Strategy for Securing the Realm, which was written for Benjamin Netanyahu. And the people who wrote that paper for Benjamin Netanyahu were people like David Wormser, Douglas Faith, Richard Pearl, also Dr. Myra Wormser, who was David Wormser's wife, I believe. Mm-hmm. And when you look at and this paper was a strategy for giving Israel dominance in the Middle East and gaining power over all of its enemies. Then later on, these same people who wrote this policy paper for Israel were part of the neocon organization for Bush. And even before Bush, I believe it was in the Reagan era, that the Project for the New American Century was first written, but by these same Zionists who were, most of them were dual Israeli citizens. And that Project for the New American Century targeted unending wars, and it also was detailed to point out the countries they wanted to attack and destroy, and Iraq was first on the list. And they knew that the time that something had to take place. There had to be a catalyst to take place for them to really act on this plan. And the same people who wrote that paper back then and during the Reagan era, the Project for the New American Century, were the ones who came into power with the neocons under the Bush administration. And 1 year before 9/11 took place, in one of PNAC's major reports, written in 2000, I think it was Dov Zakheim, who was at one time the comptroller for the Pentagon, he noted that the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. So 9/11 was that Pearl Harbor event for them. So the plans that they detail, and anyone can go and look up a Project for a New American Century, PNAC is the acronym, and look at the aims of that project, aims of what it was meant to accomplish. And when you look at the aims of what it meant to accomplish, and you look at what's happening in the world today, you can see that 9/11, the act of 9/11, the attacks that took place on that day, is really accomplishing all the goals set out for them on this in the Project for the New American Century. So that's something that anyone can easily verify. So 9/11 has specific goals there were specific goals, specific objectives that the perpetrators of 9/11 wanted to achieve, and one of them was to gain dominance over the resources in the Middle East, give Israel dominance over the Middle East, to start this unending wars which will benefit the military-industrial complex. In fact, many of the same people who were part of the PNAC plan were also members of the boards for many of these companies that produce military equipment, so they got rich. And it was something that, when you look at the benefits gained as a result of the wars in Iraq, the wars in Afghanistan, and you look at the project for the New American Century policy paper, you would see that it was a clear one-to-one match in terms of what was their desire in what they wrote as their plans and what was being implemented.
Exactly, and that's is also interesting because when we were talking about the project for a New American Century, if you remember Joseph Stalin, right? And his writings, he basically he also laid out very clearly what he would do afterwards. What he would do later on. I mean, you look at the whole all these events. Really, I mean, when we talk about the project for a New American Century, ties on for what all nefarious organizations that have been bent on trying to create a new order in the world have stated repeatedly in how they come to fruition so unexpectedly and coincidentally, but they're not really coincidences because they're a part of this plan. When we talk about 9/11, actually, interesting enough, I have an issue of the Barnes Review in my hand right now, and in this issue of the Barnes Review, there's actually I can't get to the page right now, but it was a discussion about how the American government, along with with the various intelligence organizations, is trying to essentially create a type of ripple effect among, particularly among Iran's ethnic minorities, to promote the integration of Iran. They've been doing this in the Baluchi, the Arab, and the Kurdish areas of Iran. Just like they did in Iraq.
Yeah, but they've been doing that for a long time, though, Saeed.
Yeah.
I have written about this many years ago. They've been doing this with Iran, trying to stir up internal strife and rife with the Iranian people for quite a long time, and they had financed a lot of these opposition movements, against Iran. But go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you.
No, go. Actually, this is interesting. Please expand.
Yes. So that's something that's been there for what they had wanted to do. But you were making a point, and I'm sorry to just interrupt your train of thought.
There was a point about I was going to mention 1975 with the Kurds in northern Iraq. Henry Kissinger, the failed Kurdish revolt that was. This is the Kurdish revolt that was staged, but then the U.S. later withdrew its support for the Kurds in Iraq in an effort to really destabilize Iraq. But but then again, this is all a part of this whole process that we've been talking about and how it ties in with 9/11 and this whole show that we're having about 9/11 Truth and Consequences, because these events are staged purposely to create chaos, to create havoc, and inevitably they result in further American and Israeli geopolitical aggrandizement, as well as furthering the interests of empire, especially in the Middle East. Whether it's 9/11 or whether it's creating, riling up various ethnic minorities in the Middle East. Go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't mean, if you finish, I'll go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I'm finished.
Okay. In talking about 9/11, we can spend a lot of time with the circumstantial and the forensic evidence to show that, one, Israelis were definitely involved, and two, the 9/11 fiction that they told Americans about how it happened doesn't make any kind of sense scientifically. It goes against the laws of nature and so forth. But I think of even more importance is to look at what were the objectives for the 9/11 event. What were the goals that the 9/11 event was meant to accomplish for the perpetrators? And from what I was able to determine, I see 5 major goals that the 9/11 event was meant to accomplish. And what I want to do, Sayeed, is list them, and if you want, we can talk about them. If you agree or disagree or see other goals as more important, let me know as well.
No, go ahead.
The goals that I saw, goal number 1 was Afghanistan. To gain control of $6 trillion worth of oil and natural gas in Central Asia. This oil and gas is associated with the Caspian Sea basin and the countries surrounding it where pipelines were to be laid. So this thing of fighting the Taliban and fighting terrorism in Afghanistan is a lot of nonsense. The whole purpose of that is to lay pipelines to have a conduit for oil and gas to go out to the emerging markets in the Far East and China and India and gain the wealth that this emerging markets can gain them through the great discoveries that took place in the Caspian Sea. And we'll talk about that later because I want to talk about the Israeli involvement with this what we call the TAPI pipeline, which is the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India type pipeline that is really owned and managed by an Israeli company, owned and managed by an ex-Mossad agent, and they are the ones who are racking up income from this. The second goal that I see as important for the 9/11 perpetrators was use the events of 9/11 as a catalyst to execute the project for a new American century, which we just talked about, the PNAC plan, whose national security strategy, which was developed in 1997 by the same neocons and leadership under the Bush administration, includes, and I want us to think about each one of these items that the PNAC plan was meant to accomplish. 1, attacking possible future competitors first. That was one of the goals of the PNAC plan. And when you look at what happened with Iraq, you see that as something they're doing. Iraq never attacked the U.S., but under this fake idea of weapons of mass destruction, they preemptively attacked Iraq. This idea of preemption has been something that was done by Israelis for years in terms of how they treated the other Middle Eastern countries. Now America has adopted that, and now they want to preemptively attack Iran. They've also preemptively attacked Afghanistan, claiming they were going after bin Laden, even though the Taliban was willing to offer them bin Laden if America has showed any proof that bin Laden was involved with the 9/11 events. So this action of preemption is something that we see as part of the PNAC plan. A second thing the PNAC plan states is that they want to assume regional domination by force of arms in the Middle East. Okay, and you look at the built-up military power of of Israel in the Middle East. It's the only country that has hundreds of nukes. So, and their military might cannot be compared to any one of the other countries in the Middle East. They also want to gain control of energy resources around the globe. I think it was Professor James Petrus. Are you familiar with him, Sayeed?
Very familiar with him. Outstanding writer.
Outstanding. Good.
Intellectual. Outstanding writer, intellectual. Go ahead.
But James Petrus made an interesting point in many of his writings and interviews and commentaries. One of the points he made, he said, the oil companies were happy to have the opportunity to do business with Iraq, Iran, and those other oil-producing countries in the Middle East. He said They knew that war and instability was bad for their business, so they were not the ones pushing for war in the Middle East. And I remember an interview that he did